I would say that they brought out the best and the worst in one another as a duo, and that maybe the rivalry was there in a kind of form of competition, but also as a way, I think, to spur one another on. I think that they, each one in their own way, did their best work because of their interaction with the other.
Mark Braude discusses his new biography, Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris. Plus, my colleagues Liz Egan and Greg Cowles talk about what they've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's August 12th. I'm John Williams. A quick programming note at the top this week. The podcast will be going on hiatus. After 11 delightful years at the Times, I am moving on to work at the Washington Post. I want to thank Pamela Paul, the previous host, and Sam Tannenhouse, the previous host, for shepherding the show, for being such great colleagues, and leaving me to host it for a few months. It was great fun, and I hope you enjoyed it. After a week off next week, we'll be rerunning some of our favorite interviews from the show's 15 plus years for a while, and we'll let you know how and when the show will return. You can follow us on Twitter at nytimesbooks or sign up for our weekly newsletters at nytimes.com/newsletters. Mark Braude is here from his home in Vancouver. His new book is Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris. Mark, thanks for joining me to talk about it.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to it.
So as our reviewer notes, this tells the story of Left Bank Paris in the 1920s through mostly the lens of Kiki Man Ray, who our reviewer says is usually cast as a bit player. So my first question, I guess, is what made you want to put Kiki in the starring role in this book?
It came out of teaching, really, and my own ignorance about what I was teaching. A few years ago, I'd be doing courses in the history of modern art or the history of Paris. And when I get to the surrealists in the 1920s, I would introduce Man Ray and I would show his iconic image. It's called Le Violon d'Ingres, Ingres' Violin from 1924, of a woman whose nude back and backside have been marked up with the F-holes of a violin. And I would talk a bit about Man Ray, and then I would say, the model in this picture was known as Kiki de Montparnasse. She was a well-known artist model in her era and was said to be romantically linked to Man Ray when the image was made. And that's about all I would say. And it got to bugging me that I didn't know more about her. So it really was the simple desire to find out a little bit more to pass along to the students and for myself. And as I started digging, I realized right away, it turned out that actually Kiki, at the time when that image was made in 1924, was by far the more influential figure in Paris. Here I was teaching this iconic Man Ray image of a model named Kiki, and the truth was, the few people who saw that image when it first appeared would probably have thought of it as, there's our iconic Kiki, who's been photographed by her boyfriend Man Ray.
So when you say influential, in what ways was she influential in Paris at the time?
Well, we can start with her modeling work. She was the most sought-after artist model in the 1920s. So she posed, of course, for Man Ray, but also for Modigliani, for Chaim Soutine, for Moïse Kisling, for Suguhara Fujita, and actually for Alexander Calder. He did a wire sculpture of her. The artists in Montparnasse, in this bohemian quarter in Paris, were actually competing in a way to capture Kiki. She had an exciting look. She had a kind of fringe bob haircut at a time when that was quite daring, and an unusual energy that I think they were trying to capture. So that was one way in which she was influential, is simply she was very sought after as a model. But then as the decade progressed, she moved into performing. She was a quite dazzling cabaret performer at a little club called The Jockey, and started acting in silent films, experimental and commercial, and was drawing and painting herself, and had a show in 1927 that sold out. And I think most importantly was a writer. She wrote a memoir, a short memoir, that when it came out in 1929, made front page news in Paris.
What was her own art like? What were her paintings like?
So there was a collector named Henri-Pierre Rocher who went on to write the book Jules et Jim that Truffaut based the film on, who in the 20s was a pretty influential art dealer and collector. And he said that Kiki's work reminded him of Matisse. There's simple lines, quick lines, bright colors, and they're scenes of her childhood. She grew up in a rural setting, so there's a lot of pastoral scenes. I don't know that I make the point that she was an exceptional painter. I think she was a good painter and painted very honestly and very authentically, but I don't know that I'm making the point that that was where she shone the brightest. I think her performance is really where she was exceptional.
You make the point, I think, that what she really did, as you write in the book, was capture the spirit of the age like no one else. And it was an age where, even though there was a lot of obviously tremendous work that has lasted from then, the spirit has also lasted. It's this place that we just have a sort of insatiable appetite for in terms of hearing the stories and what life was like for artists back then. When you say she captured that spirit like no one else, what do you mean by that?
It's a mix of a sort of deep pain and a very deep love of life that comes out of the First World War. And we've heard this story, I think, about the 20s in Paris, that a lot of that freewheeling, roaring 20s attitude and lifestyle came out of a sense of loss from this great crisis that everyone had passed through. But some of that we get through Americans in Paris, right? We get the Hemingway, Fitzgerald crowd. And Kiki, to me, represents something that sometimes gets overlooked, is the French contribution to this scene and to this moment. I think that people like Kiki were part of the reason why expats found France and Paris so exciting. We're somebody who were living on a completely different rhythm and in a completely different way. She was just undeniably herself, wasn't putting on any airs. And I think in some ways, and just loved life. She just wanted to do everything and meet everyone and go everywhere. And she did. And I think in that way, the spirit of adventure, the spirit of wanting to learn, of wanting to express herself, and not having that tied to any sort of ego or ambition or desire for money, was to me some of the best of what that era had to offer.
It's interesting that she came to represent this kind of cosmopolitanism because she was born in 1901 in a village very far from Paris, when being even semi-far from Paris meant that you were essentially, rural. She was raised by her grandmother. And at 12, her mother, who was in Paris, as you put it, called for her, and she went to Paris. You paint a picture of her as a child as very earthy. You recount her at 10 years old, deciding to skip school most days and spending most of her time outside. She's doing things like foraging for strawberries and mushrooms. So when she moves to Paris at 12, how does she take to the city initially?
And that's exactly why I was drawn to her story, is that her trajectory is so unlikely. And when she gets to the city to rejoin her mother, she has very little schooling and very few options. So she takes a series of menial jobs, laboring jobs. One of her jobs is to oil and repair dead soldiers' boots so that they can be sent back to soldiers fighting at the front. I think her steadiest job was working as a baker's assistant, which she unfortunately lost because one day she decided to mark up her eyebrows with some burnt matchstick. And the baker's wife, seeing her, called her what I guess would translate in English as a tart. And she then proceeded to punch the baker's wife in the face and lost her job.
That'll do it.
And from then was drifting and really at a loss. And was a teenager and really had no money, and happened to run into one of the bakery's regulars who was a sculptor. And she went to pose for him. And it was good work. She liked the work. It paid well. And it also put her in contact with art, which was what she truly loved. She loved artists and she loved art. So here was a way to sort of be part of that community. And she just made that life for herself. The way to do so was to go to a cafe known as the Rotonde in the heart of Montparnasse. And in the back room was where the artists and models congregated, and each side was meeting the other and negotiating posing. And you had to sort of earn your way into that back room. There was a strict pecking order. Even among these bohemians that we think of as wild and unkempt and chaotic, this was a very strict order. And you had to earn your way in there. And the way to do it was through charm. And Kiki was very charming. She was very smart and very funny. And though she was quite unkempt and an outsider and had this weird accent, she got her way into the back room. And that was the beginning of posing for all these people, which then also got her to get to do what she really wanted to do, which was sing and draw and paint and write.
Do we know whether she had much exposure to art growing up with her grandmother as a child, or did all of that exposure and the initial passion for it happen when she got to Paris?
I think there was a hunger in her teenage years to live a romantic life. I don't think it came from childhood education or exposure. I think it was when she got to the big city, her eyes were just wide for every moment that she was there. She just loved Paris as much as she identified as somebody from the countryside and loved her grandmother and loved her village, Paris just opened her up. And, I make the point in the book that this is actually not an unusual occurrence in a sense, although I say that her trajectory is unlikely. Paris in the 20s was Paris in the 20s because it welcomed so many outsiders. It was the most cosmopolitan place on earth, possibly in some ways, in this little neighborhood. There was a huge contingent of Eastern European Jews who made contributions, people from all over Europe, the Americans. And I don't think it's coincidental that this place where there was a cosmopolitan outlook and a welcoming outlook was also the hotbed for so much new art to be created. I think those two went hand in hand. It was not to say that Paris was without its problems, but I think in this little magic circle of Montparnasse, there was the idea that you could come there and live as you wanted to, regardless of where you came from and who you were.
So she posed for many artists, as you noted. What was her initial relationship with Man Ray like? He was himself an American expat from Philadelphia, and did they quickly fall in love?
They met, as everyone did at that time, in the cafe, introduced through a mutual friend, a Russian painter. And I think that there was a spark. He wanted to photograph her. Actually, he saw himself as a painter at that time, first and foremost, and he wanted to photograph her so that he could paint from the photographs. And she didn't want that because she didn't want nude photos of her spread around Paris. So they had to come to terms that he wasn't going to do that and that it would be tasteful. And I think there was a bit of a spark personally that was going alongside the artistic adventure that they were going on together. And I think it happened quite quickly and they moved in together. Really, I think after 2 sessions of photography, they got together and then took an apartment together in Montparnasse. And I think that she really was the one that introduced Man Ray around. He knew some of the artists, but to be seen with Kiki, who was, in a sense, the icon of the neighborhood, I think also opened some doors for him.
Her name, Kiki, is a nickname that could be taken different ways. She embraced it. How and why did she get that nickname?
One of her early boyfriends was the painter Maurice Medjewski, and he gave her that nickname. And we don't know if maybe it came from Alice, which was her given name. She was born Alice Prin, and Aliki, Kiki. But it was also just, as you say, a sort of bit of French slang that meant a bunch of different things. It was actually, you could call somebody's neck, especially if it was being hanged, a Kiki. There are little, like chicken giblets could be a Kiki. The French used Kiki in the way that prostitute's John would be said in English. So it just sort of was one of the things, it stuck. And then the funny thing is she also started posing for Moise Kisling, who also went by Kiki. And they also had the same fringe haircut. So it was almost like they were brother and sister. And there was a little bit of a fight for who had the rightful claim to that name. But I think the actual bigger point was she was not alone in adopting an alias, in a sense, or inventing a personality for herself, or a persona for herself, I should say. Many people, Man Ray, of course, is one, who were in that place at that time, were self-invented. And I think the name went along with it.
We've gotten to the art and love in your subtitle, but it also includes rivalry. What is that element?
Kiki and Man Ray were together off and on for about 8 years in the 1920s. And while I think that Man Ray, this is based on the research I've done, genuinely admired Kiki's talent in various venues in which she was trying to express herself, I think he was also quite jealous and also very hesitant to share any kind of spotlight, and also could be on a personal level very violent and very mean. And so I would say that they brought out the best and the worst in one another as a duo, and that maybe the rivalry was there in a kind of form of competition, but also as a way, I think, to spur one another on. I think that they, each one in their own way, did their best work because of their interaction with the other, whether that was for good or for bad. I think there was just a spark, a dynamic there, and it brings us back to that image that I was talking about at the beginning, this Le Violon d'Ingres with Kiki with her back turned to Man Ray's camera. You only see her face in profile just slightly. But even there, you can see, at least I can, when I look at it, some kind of mystery, some kind of dance going on there that I think is why that picture and so many of the pictures they made together remain so alluring almost a century later. There's something in that dance between the two of them.
You mentioned her memoir, which I think is out of print in the States at the moment. I'm wondering what that book is like, how it reads, what kind of a help it was to you in writing this book and maybe recreating some of the scene. I assume you open with her singing in this very vivid scene, describing her performance. I assume her singing has not survived.
There are a few records of her singing, a few minutes of her performing on camera in these films, a few of her paintings, a few of her drawings, but that's really it. So much of what she did was fleeting in a sense, or not there to be documented. And as I say in the book, it's very hard to trademark it, a pose or a dance or auction off charisma. And the memoir, which she wrote in 1929, is really her life story. And it came out when she was not yet 30. And I tracked down one of the few remaining 100 copies from a rare bookseller in France right early in the project, because I thought it would be quite important to get the original. And it's filled with really great photos and paintings of her. It's a short little book, but she was a very insightful writer. She could size somebody up in a few words and be ironic and biting, but also very warm and tender towards people. I think she really just loved people and loved them for all of their quirks and foibles. And it comes across on the page. The English edition came out a year later in Paris. Ernest Hemingway wrote the introduction. And he, in his introduction, brings up Moll Flanders. He brings up E. E. Cummings, Virginia Woolf. He saw her as a good prose stylist as well. I think that he liked that style. She's very to the point and very insightful.
You have written in fairly quick succession books about what seem on the surface to be very different subjects. There's a history of Monte Carlo and it's being built into the casino resort, the story of Napoleon in exile, and now this one. Does anything tie them together for you, or do you follow your interests where they lead?
I'm realizing now that I'm just getting smaller and smaller in what I'm looking at. I started with Monaco, which is the world's second smallest country, and then got to Napoleon on Elba on this little tiny island. And now I'm in a single little neighborhood of Montparnasse, really tightly focused on this little community. And I guess what I'm trying to do with all of those is say, here is something that maybe we think we know, or maybe is small and insignificant. And if you just look at it from a slightly different perspective, a slightly different angle, you can really tell a whole new story. And so with Kiki, I thought, well, here's this neighborhood and this time that is so well known. But if we just look at it from her perspective, where in the past she's been a bit player or a side player, and make her the focus, it opens up all of these different doors and we start to interact with all of these different people and see it from the perspective of a French person.
Well, it is a fascinating look at the time period. Like you said, a well-covered one, but this, I think, does offer a different lens and a personality that maybe people should know more about. The book, again, is Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris. Mark Braude, thanks for being here to talk about it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I'm joined now by my colleagues Greg Cowles and Elisabeth Egan to talk about what we've all been reading. Hello, you two.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Greg, let's start with you. What have you been up to?
Well, I'm reading a book called River of Mountains. The author is Peter Lorre. It's Lourie, and it was published almost 30 years ago by Syracuse University Press. It's about the author's canoe trip from the very top of the Hudson River down to Manhattan, where the Hudson empties into the ocean. You may remember earlier this year, I reviewed Ben McGrath's book, Riverman, about a solo canoeist who did these kind of epic journeys, including a trip down the Hudson as part of his trip from Canada to Florida, and disappeared along the way. And so I came across this Peter Lorre book doing research for that review, but didn't read it at the time. And Liz and John, you probably both know that I'm a pretty avid kayaker, and I harbor a long time dream of kayaking the Hudson myself. So when I found this book, I ordered it and set it aside, and I finally started reading it on this vacation I was just on. And in some ways, it's whetting my appetite to canoe the Hudson, to kayak the Hudson. And in other way is it really should act as a deterrent, because I did not realize up at the top of the Hudson and maybe the first 50 miles of it, it has some of the fiercest rapids on all of the East Coast. The Hudson is a pretty sleepy tidal river on its lower portion. I say tidal, there are times that it moves upstream as the tides come in, and you have to time your paddling on it if you don't want to work against the tides. But in the top part of it, it drops precipitously from its source through like very narrow channels and is class 4 rapids with boulders, and it's pretty hairy in the early going. And Peter Lorre, who I had never heard of before, but is kind of a journeyman adventurer, riverman himself, and longtime writer who wrote about canoeing the Amazon and many bigger, more consequential rivers than the Hudson. But this was like a personal trip that he took, and he describes it all really well and makes it thrilling for what is ultimately kind of a sleepy river.
This is much more well-timed than you realized, Greg. I happened to be in Maine this week, and I actually went on a canoe trip yesterday, around a relatively small bay. I'm a pretty good kayaker. I mean, not like you. I know that the fact that you even dream of doing the entire Hudson, that's a whole other universe. But I'm good in a kayak moment to moment. And in the canoe, I just felt over my head, let's say, although we didn't capsize. So not literally over my head.
He hires a guide to go through the rapids with him because he realizes how risky it is. And they send a kayaker ahead of them to navigate it first. And you get the feeling it's a lot safer going through in a kayak than it is in a canoe. And so I'm still probably going to do this.
I look forward to your memoir about it.
I was just going to say, I can't wait to read the book. Also, it sounds like you need to reread Cowboys Are My Weakness by Pam Houston. And that book by Elisabeth Hyde, where they go canoeing in the Grand Canyon and somebody has well, I won't.
Oh, God.
It has a sad ending, but it's so good. I think it's called Into the Canyon.
I will say that as good as Lorre is at describing the actual canoeing and the river, and he's this kind of wonderfully game narrator where he meets people and starts talking to them, and they're like, at one point, he chances across a false tooth factory, like a family-run company that makes false teeth for like the local prison towns. And he starts talking to them. And so there's this sense of he's just exploring. There's also kind of a slippery tone in it sometimes where it's funny. His author photo, he looks like John Cleese as a barrister. He's like balding with a big bushy mustache, and he's wearing a tie and sweater. And he's the last person you expect to be canoeing down the Hudson River. There are times that his voice slips into kind of a like 70s hippie-ish vibe. He talks about standing naked at the Hudson and feeling more vulnerable than he does the first time he's standing in front of a woman as she reaches for him. And you think, I don't need that description in here.
When was this book published?
1995, and it's recounting a trip that he took in 1990. But again, he's a real journeyman, and he'd been doing exactly this kind of book for decades before that. So when I say this like 70s hippie-ish vibe, I think that's what drove him to exactly this kind of adventure.
He's a journeyman in the sense that he always journeys back to the 1970s. Liz, what are you reading these days? Anything adventurous?
Okay, well, you're catching me on one of the most important days of the year for me, and I know that both of you will relate to this. I am about to go on vacation for a week. And so while some people strategize very carefully about what clothing they're bringing and what dinner reservations they have, I have planned my reading list with kind of military precision. So I have a stack of 7 galleys of books that are coming out mainly this fall, 6 novels and 1 memoir. And I am heading south to South Carolina. So I have also just tracked down a book that came out 20 years ago this week, actually, called Colony by Anne Rivers Siddons, who is one of the great Southern novelists, I think. And it's a novel about a woman from South Carolina who marries a guy from a very aristocratic family in Maine, John. So maybe you should look into this book also. And it's the story of 70 summers that she spends going from Charleston, which she knows well, where she's comfortable, into this upper crust family compound in Maine. And I'd like to also bring a Pat Conroy book with me because I love Pat Conroy and he also writes about this part of the world that I'm visiting. And I was wondering, I'm thinking I'm going to bring The Prince of Tides, but I had a feeling the two of you might have some opinions about Pat Conroy books.
Have you never read The Prince of Tides?
Oh my God, are you kidding me? It's one of my favorites. But but I'm wondering what your favorite Pat Conroy novel is and what you would recommend.
I have to confess, I've never read any Pat Conroy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think this is funny. You get old enough and I don't think I read The Great Santini. I know that a lot of people love that book. I think our own Dwight Garner, if I remember, I don't mean to put words in his mouth, but I think he's a fan. I did read and greatly like The Prince of Tides many moons ago, speaking of tides. And my parents were both big fans of it. And so I think I read it when I was, 18 or something, and really loved it. But I think that's the only book of his maybe that I've read.
Well, then you have a treat ahead of many treats ahead of you. I think you would love The Great Santini. You should get your hands on it as soon as possible.
I will do that. How many other novels did he write?
Oh gosh, so many, many, many novels. I don't have the number.
So it's you who have the strong opinions about Pat Conroy. You thought Greg and I might.
Yes, I'm shocked. Greg, you seem like a Conroy fan to me.
I know that there is a copy of The Great Santini on the shelf at my parents' house because I always saw it growing up and confused it from the title a little bit with The Great Train Robbery by Paul Theroux. It was one of those books that I just always thought I might pick up and never did. And then I think public opinion curdled on Conroy a little bit. There was a time I was reading Frank Conroy on the train into the city once, and the woman next to me said, "Oh, I love that book. He's so much better than that hack Pat
Oh,
Conroy."
no.
Ooh, that's mean.
Well, send that person Liz's email address. You can have a little fight.
My favorite is Anne River Siddons, and I have a feeling the two of you might not be her biggest fan, but I love the marriage of Maine and South Carolina that I will find in Colony. John, what are you reading?
I am reading something that I'm going to recommend maybe the writer more generally speaking, and I might have spoken about him earlier this year on the podcast at some point, the great Austrian writer Joseph Roth. I reviewed a slender book that was recently translated called Rebellion, which I really enjoyed. And I loved his book, Job, which is brilliant. And I'm reading his last novel, which is called The Emperor's Tomb. And the reason I'm saying that I'll recommend him more generally is that I'm only about a third of the way into it. But from my own experience reading it so far and from what I've read about it, it's not, it's his last work and it's maybe not his most major work. One of his great subjects was the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a great personal devastation to him. And what's probably considered his most classic book, The Radetzky March, is a sweeping family story about the empire before the war and its dissolution. And The Emperor's Tomb is more between the wars, and it's about a Viennese man living essentially in the years that lead up to the maybe first hints of the Nazi regime. And it has great moments. I mean, I think I've come this year to finally read him more broadly and appreciate him more. And so I think everything he wrote has a certain vitality to it and great observations, but this is maybe a little bit more disjointed, feels maybe a bit like a final work that didn't quite get to where he wanted it to be. But obviously if you're a completist, it's more than worthwhile. And I would suggest just reading him in general, especially I hate sort of resonances in fiction, but the way people try to make everything fit to our current day. But I think it certainly has a lot to say about politically tumultuous times. And he's just a fantastic writer. There's nothing dusty or eat your vegetables about him. He, in the way that some classics can at least initially feel like, you don't even have to really adjust to his voice. It's just really great from the get-go.
Which says something about the translator too, of course.
This particular one was translated by Michael Hoffman, who's done several of his other books and is a very renowned and acclaimed translator. Let's go over what we read again.
River of Mountains by Peter Lorre.
Among many other books, I am now reading Colony by Anne River Siddons.
And I'm reading The Emperor's Tomb by Joseph Roth. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.